What if the woman who stepped off that train wasn't who she claimed to be? What if the gentle mail-order bride hiding behind that shamisen carried secrets dark enough to get everyone killed? This isn't just another frontier love story. This is about a woman running from murder charges, a widowed farmer with his own hidden past, and the moment when their carefully constructed lies collided with deadly truth. Caleb Morrison thought he was buying a simple farm wife. Instead, he got Keiko, a woman who could write business letters, play haunting music, and heal with ancient remedies. But when wanted posters arrived from San Francisco, he discovered his wife wasn't just educated, she was wanted for triple murder. What he didn't know was that she had witnessed something that powerful men would kill to keep secret. But here's the twist that changes everything. Caleb Morrison wasn't just a farmer either. And when those killers finally came to his doorstep, they had no idea what they were walking into. If you want to know how a shamisen, a jade bracelet, and one perfectly timed lie turned a mail-order marriage into the most dangerous gamble of their lives, then you need to hear this story from the beginning. Don't scroll away, because what happens in the next 60 minutes will completely change how you think about love survival and the courage it takes to stop running. She is my wife. Widowed farmer defends mail-order bride, then discovers her shocking truth. The advertisement in the dusty pages of the San Francisco Chronicle had been simple enough. Wife wanted, hardworking, compliant woman to manage household and care for motherless child. Rural Montana, serious inquiries only. For Caleb Morrison, it was a transaction born of necessity, not desire. He had sent the money a sum that represented 3 months of back-breaking work on his struggling homestead and waited with the grim patience of a man who had learned to expect little from life. He expected calloused hands and a weathered face. He expected silence broken only by the sound of cooking and cleaning. He expected function, not feeling. He did not expect the woman who stepped from the afternoon train onto the warped wooden platform of Dust Devil Creek. The first thing he noticed was not her face, though it was striking in its quiet composure, nor her simple gray traveling dress, though it was clean and well-mended. It was the case she carried, polished wood, oddly shaped, held with the careful reverence one might reserve for something precious. Mai Tanaka moved with deliberate grace through the small cluster of onlookers who had gathered to witness the arrival of Morrison's mail-order bride. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, but a few rebellious strands caught the late afternoon light, giving her an almost ethereal quality that seemed entirely at odds with the harsh landscape around them. Caleb's jaw tightened as he approached. This was not the woman from the photograph he'd received. That woman had been plain sturdy, with the practical bearing of someone accustomed to hard work. This woman looked like she belonged in a drawing room, not a one-room cabin 20 miles from nowhere. Mr. Morrison. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a barely perceptible accent that spoke of distant shores and different customs. He nodded once, his eyes fixed on the strange case in her hands. "What's that?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her composed features. "It is a shamisen, a musical instrument. I thought perhaps music." The word came out flat, edged with something that might have been contempt. "You brought music to a place where the nearest neighbor is half a day's ride away." She looked down at the case, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. "I can leave it here if you prefer." Something in her tone, not defiance but a quiet dignity that refused to be completely diminished, gave him pause. He studied her face, noting the way she held herself despite his obvious displeasure. There was steel beneath the silk strength, hidden behind the deceptive fragility. "No," he said finally. "You brought it this far." The wagon ride to his homestead stretched out like a study in careful silence. Mai sat in the back, her precious case beside her, watching the vast Montana landscape unfold in waves of golden grass and distant mountains. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the horizon but found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she adjusted her shawl against the wind, the way she observed everything with those dark, intelligent eyes. Intelligent. That was another thing he hadn't expected. The sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose when they finally reached his land. The cabin sat in a shallow valley surrounded by fields that spoke of hard work and harder living. It was a simple structure, logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney, windows that were more functional than decorative. Behind it stood a small barn and chicken coop, and beyond that the endless expanse of prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Mai stepped down from the wagon and stood for a moment, taking in her new home. If she was disappointed, she gave no sign. Instead, she picked up her case and her small traveling bag and waited. "That's your room?" Caleb gestured toward a small alcove curtained off from the main living space. "You'll cook, clean, and help with the child. Her name is Lily. She's 7. As if summoned by her name, a small face appeared in the doorway. Lily Morrison had her father's serious gray eyes and hair the color of summer wheat. But where Caleb's expression was hard and closed, hers was simply empty. She watched the strange woman with the careful wariness of a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. "Hello, Lily," Mai said gently, crouching down to the child's eye level. "I am Mai." Lily said nothing, but her gaze shifted to the wooden case. "What's in there?" "Something that makes music," Mai replied. "Would you like to hear it?" Before the child could answer, Caleb stepped between them. "Lily has chores, and so do you. Supper needs making, and the fire's nearly out." Mai rose smoothly, any disappointment carefully hidden. "Of course, where might I find the kitchen supplies?" The next hour passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of domestic routine. Mai moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, taking inventory of what was available and what was lacking. The pantry was sparse but adequate: flour beans, salt pork, a few preserved vegetables. She worked without comment, building up the fire-heating water, beginning the process of transforming basic ingredients into something resembling a meal. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye as he went about his evening chores. Her movements were too practiced, too refined for someone who should have been desperate enough to answer his advertisement. The way she handled the cookware, the way she organized the workspace, it all spoke of experience, but not the kind gained from necessity alone. When he returned from milking the cow, the cabin was transformed. Candles had been lit, casting warm light across surfaces that gleamed from a thorough scrubbing. The air was filled with the rich aroma of beans flavored with herbs he didn't recognize, and fresh bread cooling on the wooden counter. Lily sat at the table, her eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. "She made the bread sing," the child whispered as her father took his seat. Caleb frowned. "What?" "When she needed it, she hummed, made the bread happy." Mai set bowls before them, her movements graceful despite the humble crockery. "My mother used to say that food prepared with music tastes better. Perhaps it is foolish." "It's different," Caleb said carefully. The bread was indeed different, lighter than anything he'd managed to produce in the past 2 years, with a texture that spoke of practiced hands and patient timing. They ate in relative silence, but it was not the oppressive quiet that had characterized mealtimes since Sarah's death. There was something warmer about it, more alive. After supper, as Caleb tended to paperwork and Lily played quietly with a corn husk doll, Mai unpacked her few belongings in the small alcove that would serve as her bedroom. The space was barely large enough for the narrow cot and single wooden chest that comprised its furnishings, but she arranged her things with the same careful attention she'd given to the kitchen. Her belongings were few, but telling: several changes of clothing, all well made but worn, a small sewing kit with needles that gleamed like silver, a bundle of herbs wrapped in silk, a leather-bound book written in characters Caleb couldn't identify, and a smaller wooden box that she handled with particular care. She was aware of his observation, though she gave no sign of it. Let him wonder, she thought. There would be time enough for explanations, or perhaps there would not. Perhaps it would be better if some things remained hidden. The book was her most precious possession after the shamisen, a collection of poetry her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. The wooden box contained something even more valuable, a small jade bracelet, the last gift from her parents before the great earthquake had taken everything she'd ever known. As the evening deepened, Caleb found himself stealing glances at the woman who now shared his home. She had taken up some mending one of Lily's dresses that had torn at the seam, and her fingers moved with the kind of precision that spoke of formal training. The stitches were tiny and even nearly invisible when she finished. "You sew well," he said, surprising himself with the observation. She looked up from her work, and for a moment their eyes met across the small space. "My mother taught me." She believed that any work worth doing was worth doing beautifully. There was something in her voice, a note of loss that resonated with his own grief. For the first time since she'd stepped off the train, Caleb felt a flicker of genuine curiosity about the woman he'd married sight unseen. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" A shadow crossed her features so quickly he might have imagined it. Here and there, I have moved around quite a bit. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. But Caleb had his own secrets, his own reasons for choosing isolation over the complications of town life. He could hardly fault her for the same reticence. The shamisen, he said finally. How long have you played? Her hands stilled on the mending. Since I was very small. My grandmother taught me. She said music was the language of the heart, when words were not enough. Lily looked up from her doll, interested despite herself. Can you play it now? Mai glanced at Caleb, waiting for permission or prohibition. After a long moment, he gave a slight nod. She retrieved the case from beside her cot and opened it with reverent care. The instrument inside was beautiful in its simplicity, 3 strings stretched over a long wooden neck, with a body that curved like a teardrop. The wood was darkened with age and use, and there were tiny mother-of-pearl inlays that caught the candlelight. Mai tuned the strings with practiced ease, her ear attuned to subtle variations in pitch that escaped her audience entirely. Then she began to play. The music that filled the cabin was unlike anything Caleb had ever heard. It was haunting and sweet, with a quality that seemed to reach directly into the chest and squeeze the heart. The melody was simple but profound, speaking of longing and loss of distances that couldn't be measured in miles. Lily set down her doll and moved closer, drawn by the strange beauty of the sound. Even Caleb found himself leaning forward, his usually rigid posture relaxing as the music washed over him. When the last note faded into silence, the cabin seemed almost bereft without it. That was beautiful, Lily whispered. Mai smiled, the first genuine smile Caleb had seen from her. It is a very old song, about a woman who traveled far from home and found a new family among strangers. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Caleb cleared his throat and stood abruptly. It's late, time for bed. But as he helped Lily prepare for sleep, he found the melody lingering in his mind. And later, as he lay on his own narrow cot, listening to the wind whisper across the prairie, he could hear the soft sound of movement from behind Mai's curtain, the rustle of pages turning. She was reading by candlelight, something in that strange script he'd glimpsed earlier. Her voice was barely audible, more felt than heard, as she whispered words in a language he couldn't understand. It should have been alien, disturbing even. Instead, it was oddly comforting. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something sweet and unfamiliar that made his mouth water. Mai was already up, moving quietly around the kitchen space so as not to wake Lily. She had somehow transformed their meager supplies into what looked like a feast egg scrambled with wild onions. She must have foraged before dawn biscuits that were golden and perfectly risen, and small cakes that gleam with a honey glaze. Good morning, she said softly. I hope you do not mind that I gathered some herbs from the field. I thought they might add flavor to the eggs. Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot, stronger and richer than anything he'd managed to brew, and studied her face in the morning light. There were subtle signs of fatigue around her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept much better than he had. You were up early. I'm accustomed to rising before dawn. Old habits. Again, that sense of something unsaid. Caleb found himself wondering what kind of old habits required such early rising. Certainly not the habits of a woman desperate enough to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. Lily emerged from her small bed, drawn by the enticing smells. Her eyes widened when she saw the breakfast spread. It's like a party, she breathed. Mai's smile was gentle. Every morning is a small celebration if we choose to see it that way. The child looked puzzled by this philosophy, but she accepted a plate with eager hands. As she bit into one of the small honey cakes, her face lit up with pure joy. Papa, taste this. It's like sunshine. Despite himself, Caleb felt his mouth curve upward. It had been so long since he'd seen Lily truly happy about anything. The honey cakes were indeed remarkable, light as they were but rich with flavor, sweet but not cloying. Where did you learn to make these? He asked. For a moment, Mai's composure wavered. There was an old woman who taught me. She said that food was love made visible. There it was again, that carefully neutral response that revealed nothing while seeming to reveal everything. Caleb was beginning to recognize the pattern. Mai Tanaka had secrets, layers upon layers of them, and she guarded them with the skill of someone who had learned that revelation could be dangerous. But why? What was a woman with her obvious refinement and education doing answering an advertisement for a farmer's wife in the middle of nowhere? After breakfast, as Caleb prepared for his day in the fields, he found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about the way Mai moved through the morning routines, the way she interacted with Lily, that made the cabin feel different. More alive somehow, more like a home than the mere shelter it had become since Sarah's death. "I'll be working the north field today," he said, lingering by the door. "Lily knows where to find me if you need anything." Mai nodded, her hands already busy with the breakfast dishes. "We will be fine. Perhaps Lily could show me around the property. I would like to understand the land better." It was a reasonable request, but something in her tone suggested there was more to it than simple curiosity. Caleb found himself wondering what she was really looking for. "Stay close to the house," he said finally. "This isn't San Francisco. The land can be dangerous if you don't know it." Her hands stilled for just a moment. Of course. But as he walked toward the fields, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that Mai Tanaka knew more about dangerous land than she was letting on. There had been something in her eyes when he mentioned San Francisco, a flicker of recognition or perhaps pain that suggested he'd struck closer to home than he'd intended. The morning passed quickly as Caleb lost himself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. The late autumn sun was warm on his back as he worked to prepare the field for winter, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin and its new occupant. Everything about Mai seemed designed to contradict his expectations. Her grace, her education, her obvious refinement, none of it fit with the circumstances that should have brought her to answer his advertisement. Women with her apparent background didn't become mail-order brides unless something had gone terribly wrong in their lives. The question was what? When he returned to the house for the midday meal, he found Mai and Lily in the small garden plot behind the cabin. They had cleared away the last of the season's dead plants and were working the soil with careful attention. But what caught his eye was not their industry, it was the pattern they were creating. This was no ordinary vegetable garden. Mai was arranging stones and planting plantings in a way that spoke of aesthetic consideration as much as practical need. The layout had an almost artistic quality with spaces designated not just for food crops, but for flowers and ornamental plants. "What are you doing?" he asked. Mai looked up from where she was kneeling in the dirt, her hands dark with soil, but her movements still graceful. "Preparing for spring. I thought perhaps we could expand the garden, make it more complete." Complete how she gestured to the carefully planned spaces. Food for the body, but also food for the spirit. "Beauty has value too, does it not?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "She knows about flowers, Papa, lots of different kinds, and she says some of them can be medicine too." Caleb frowned. "Medicine? Herbs," Mai said quickly. "Simple things. Chamomile for sleep, willow bark for pain. My moth I learned from someone who understood plants." Another near revelation quickly covered. Caleb was beginning to recognize the pattern of Mai's speech, the careful corrections, the deliberate vagueness about her past. It should have irritated him. Instead, it intrigued him. Over lunch, a simple but flavorful soup made from yesterday's leftovers transformed into something entirely new. He found himself studying Mai with the careful attention he'd once given to reading the weather or judging livestock. She ate with small, precise bites, her posture erect but not stiff. Her table manners were impeccable, suggesting formal training rather than natural habit. "Lily," he said suddenly, "why don't you go check on chickens?" The child looked surprised but obedient. "Yes, Papa." When they were alone, Caleb leaned back in his chair and regarded Mai steadily. "I think it's time we talked." Her hand stilled on her spoon, but her expression remained calm. "About what?" "About who you really are. About why a woman with your obvious education and refinement is sitting in my cabin pretending to be grateful for the chance to marry a dirt farmer she's never met." For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she set down her spoon and met his gaze directly. "I am exactly who I said I am. Mai Tanaka. I answered your advertisement because I needed a home and you needed a wife. The details of my past are complicated." "Complicated how?" She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost everything in the San Francisco earthquake 3 years ago. My family, my home, My, my position. I have been moving ever since, looking for a place where I might be able to start again. It wasn't the whole truth. He could sense the gaps, the careful omissions, but it was more than she'd revealed before, and the pain in her voice was real, unmistakable. Your position. I was a teacher in Japantown. I had a small school for children whose families wanted them to learn both Japanese and American ways. Her hands twisted in her lap. When the earthquake came, I could not save them all. The words hung between them, heavy with grief and guilt. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of pain that matched his own. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to carry the weight of those you couldn't protect. How many? He asked quietly. 7 children were in the school when the building collapsed. I pulled out 4. She looked down at her hands. The other 3, I was not strong enough, not quick enough. And that's why you're here, running from that. Not running, she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that was heartbreaking in its quiet strength. Seeking, there is a difference. Caleb studied her face, seeing past the composed exterior to the wounded woman beneath. He thought of Sarah, of his own failures to protect the people he loved, of the way guilt could eat at a person until there was nothing left but the hollow shell of who they used to be. The music, he said suddenly, the cooking, the way you handle everything like it matters, that's not running, that's something else. It is remembering, she said softly, remembering that beautiful things still exist even after terrible things happen. My grandmother used to say that we honor the dead by continuing to create beauty in the world. Outside, they could hear Lily talking to the chickens in the serious, one-sided conversation she often held with creatures that couldn't answer back. The sound was so normal, so peacefully domestic, that it seemed to exist in a different world from the pain they were sharing. Why didn't you tell me this before? My smile was sad but genuine. Would you have chosen differently if you had known? Would you have wanted a wife who carried such failure with her? Caleb considered this. Would he have? 2 days ago, he would have said yes. He had wanted simplicity, functionality, a woman who would ask nothing of him but provide what he needed. Mai Tanaka was none of those things. She was complicated, wounded, full of hidden depths that both attracted and intimidated him. But watching her with Lily, seeing the way she brought light back into spaces that had been dark for too long, he found himself reconsidering what he actually needed versus what he had thought he wanted. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know I'm glad you're here now. Something in her expression softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, Mai looked at him not as a stranger or an obligation, but as a man who might understand the weight of carrying impossible burdens. Thank you, she said simply. The afternoon passed in companionable work. Mai and Lily continued their garden planning while Caleb repaired a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. But the conversation from lunch had changed something between them, created a foundation of honesty that hadn't existed before. As evening approached and the sky began to take on the deep blue gold of approaching sunset, Mai prepared another simple but excellent meal. This time, as they sat around the table, the silence felt different. Not empty or oppressive, but full of possibilities. Will you play the shamisen again tonight? Lily asked as Mai cleared the dishes. Mai glanced at Caleb, who nodded almost imperceptibly. What would you like to hear? The traveling song, the one about finding a new family. As Mai retrieved her instrument and began to tune the strings, Caleb found himself watching her with new eyes. The careful way she handled the shamisen, the concentration on her face as she adjusted the pitch, it all spoke of years of training, of dedication to an art that required both technical skill and emotional depth. When she began to play, the melody was different from the night before. Still haunting, still beautiful, but warmer somehow, more hopeful. As the music filled the cabin, Caleb realized that this was what had been missing from his life for the past 2 years. Not just companionship or help with daily tasks, but beauty. The kind of deliberate, purposeful beauty that required someone to care enough to create it. As the last notes faded, Lily leaned against Mai's shoulder with the unconscious trust of a child who had found someone safe to love. Will you teach me? She asked. Would you like to learn? Yes, but... Lily looked at her father uncertainly. Papa, would it be all right? Caleb met Mai's eyes across his daughter's head. In them, he saw not just a question about music lessons, but a deeper inquiry about belonging, about permanence, about whether this fragile new arrangement might become something more lasting. Yes, he said quietly. I think it would be all right. And as Mai smiled, the first truly unguarded expression he'd seen from her, Caleb realized that somewhere in the space between yesterday and today, his simple transaction had begun to transform into something far more complex and infinitely more valuable. The evening settled around them like a warm blanket, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Morrison began to hope that home was not just a place to survive, but a place where healing might be possible. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie grass, carrying with it the promise of changing seasons and the faint distant melody of a shamisen that spoke of journeys ending and new stories beginning. The first shamisen lesson took place on a Sunday morning when the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter. Mai had risen early as was her custom and found Caleb already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a letter he was struggling to write. Business correspondence? She asked gently, setting down a plate of rice cakes she had prepared with precious ingredients hoarded from her journey west. Caleb looked up and she noticed the tension around his eyes. Order for winter supplies. I'm not. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the admission. I'm not good with formal writing. Mai glanced at the half-finished letter, noting the crossed-out words and uneven script. Without thinking, she said, perhaps I could help. I have some experience with correspondence. The moment the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. A woman desperate enough to answer a mail-order bride advertisement would not likely have experience with formal business letters. Caleb's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of experience? Before she could formulate a careful response, Lily bounded into the room, drawn by the smell of the sweet rice cakes. Are we having the music lesson? Now you promised. Mai felt a flutter of gratitude for the child's interruption, but she could see that Caleb had filed away her slip of the tongue for future consideration. He was more observant than she had initially realized, a quality that both impressed and worried her. After breakfast, Mai said, settling into the rhythm of deflection she had perfected over the past 3 years. But first, let me help your father with this letter. She moved to stand behind Caleb's chair close enough to read over his shoulder. The letter was functional but awkward, lacking the diplomatic tone necessary for successful business negotiations. Without asking permission, she took the pen from his hand and began to make corrections, her handwriting flowing across the page in elegant loops and precise strokes. You might say, I would be grateful for your consideration of the following order, rather than I need these things, she murmured, making the changes as she spoke. And here, your prompt attention to this matter would be most appreciated sounds more persuasive than send them quick. Caleb watched in fascination as his blunt, functional prose transformed into something that sounded almost sophisticated. When she finished, the letter could have come from an educated businessman rather than an isolated rancher. Where did you learn to write like that? He asked quietly. Mai's hands stilled on the pen. She had been so focused on helping that she had forgotten to hide her capabilities. I read a great deal. You pick up certain phrases. It was a weak explanation and they both knew it. But Lily chose that moment to climb into Mai's lap, effectively ending the interrogation. Music lesson now, the child asked hopefully. Mai nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She retrieved the shamisen from its case and settled cross-legged on the floor, patting the space beside her for Lily to join her. First, she said, you must understand that this instrument is not just wood and strings. It carries stories, memories, the spirit of everyone who has played it before. Lily's eyes grew wide. Whose stories does it carry? My grandmother's, my mother's, and now perhaps yours. Mai positioned the shamisen in Lily's small hands, adjusting her grip on the neck. But before we make music, we must listen to the silence. Listen to the quiet. Yes, music lives in the spaces between notes as much as in the notes themselves. Close your eyes. Both Lily and, to Mai's surprise, Caleb closed their eyes. The cabin filled with a profound stillness, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the eaves. What do you hear? Mai asked softly. The wind, Lily said immediately. What else? The house settling, Papa's breathing, your heartbeat. Mai smiled. And now? She struck a single clear note on the shamisen. The sound seemed to expand, to fill every corner of the room, resonating long after the string stopped vibrating. It's still singing, Lily breathed. Yes, that is the first lesson. Every note continues even after we can no longer hear it. Music is not about making sound. It is about giving voice to the silence that already exists. From his chair at the table, Caleb watched this exchange with growing wonderment. The woman instructing his daughter was not the mail-order bride he had expected, nor even the refugee teacher she had revealed herself to be. This was someone with deep knowledge, formal training, the kind of education that came from years of study under masters of the art. Who was Mai Tanaka really? The lesson continued for an hour with Mai teaching Lily the proper way to hold the plectrum, how to strike the strings cleanly, how to let each note breathe before moving to the next. The child showed a natural aptitude that delighted her teacher, and by the end of the session, she could produce a simple melody that, while halting, carried genuine musicality. Beautiful, Mai said and meant it. You have good ears and patient fingers. These are gifts not everyone possesses. Lily glowed under the praise. Will you teach me every day? If your father permits it, and if we can find time between other duties. Other duties, Caleb said, finally speaking up. Speaking of which, I need to go into town tomorrow for supplies. Both of you should come. Mai's face went carefully blank. Is that necessary? I have much to do here, and Lily needs to meet people other than just us, and you. Caleb studied her face, noting the way her composure had subtly shifted. You're my wife now. People will expect to see you. The word wife hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond legal designation. They had been living as strangers sharing space. Now somehow they were being asked to present themselves as a family. Of course, Mai said finally. What time shall we leave? That evening, as Mai prepared their simple supper, she found herself thinking about the trip to town with growing apprehension. In the 3 years since leaving San Francisco, she had become adept at avoiding scrutiny, at remaining invisible in small communities where strangers were noted and discussed. Dust Devil Creek was exactly the kind of place where a new face, especially an Asian face, would attract unwanted attention. But she could not refuse without raising suspicions that might prove even more dangerous than exposure. As if sensing her distress, Caleb approached while she stood at the stove stirring a pot of stew. You're worried about tomorrow. It wasn't a question. Mai glanced at him, noting the careful way he held himself, as if ready to retreat if she denied it. Small towns can be challenging for people like me. People like you, she gestured vaguely at her face, her clothes the obvious markers of her otherness. Different. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I chose you. That's all anyone needs to know. The simple declaration hit her with unexpected force. Not I married you or you answered my advertisement, but I chose you. As if she had been selected for her value rather than acquired out of necessity. Thank you, she said softly. Besides, he added with a slight smile, wait until they taste your cooking at the church social next month. You'll have every woman in town wanting to know your secrets. Mai's blood chilled. Church social. First Saturday in November, everyone brings something to share and the new families are always expected to participate. He paused, noting her expression. Problem. A dozen problems, actually. A social gathering meant extended conversation, personal questions, the kind of close examination that could unravel carefully constructed identities. But she could hardly explain that without revealing why she needed to hide. No problem, she lied. I simply prefer quiet gatherings to large ones. That night, Mai sat in her small alcove with her leather-bound book of poetry open before her. But instead of reading the familiar verses that usually brought her comfort, she found herself staring at a blank piece of paper she had taken from Caleb's writing supplies. Almost without conscious decision, she began to write not in the careful English she spoke aloud, but in the flowing characters of her native language. The poem that emerged was one her grandmother had taught her years ago, about a crane that flew so far from home it forgot the way back until one day it heard another crane's call and remembered not where it came from, but where it belonged. She was so absorbed in the writing that she didn't notice Caleb standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat softly. I'm sorry, he said. I was just checking that you had everything you needed. Mai quickly moved to cover the paper, but not before he had seen the elegant brushstrokes, the alien beauty of the Japanese characters. What does it say? He asked, moving closer. It is difficult to translate. A poem about finding home in unexpected places. Caleb studied the characters with genuine interest rather than suspicion. Would you teach you what to read some of that. I know it's probably too complicated, but maybe just my name or yours. The request was so unexpected, so genuinely curious and free of judgment that Mai felt tears prick her eyes. In all her years in America, no one had ever asked to learn her language. Most people seemed to view it as an impediment to be overcome rather than a gift to be shared. You truly want to learn. I want to understand you better. This is part of you, isn't it? This writing, this music, all of it. Mai nodded slowly. Yes, it is who I was before I became who I am now. Then show me. She turned the paper so he could see it clearly, then took up her pen and wrote his name in careful katakana characters below the poem. Karebu, she said, pointing to each character. This is how your name would be written in Japanese. He studied the characters intently as if memorizing them. And yours, she wrote her own name, then paused and added another set of characters. This says Mai, she pointed to the first, and this says Tanaka, but this, she indicated the additional characters. This is my full name, Mai Keiko Tanaka. Keiko, it means blessed child, amen. My parents gave me this name because I was born during cherry blossom season, and they said I brought spring with me wherever I went. There was something achingly vulnerable about this revelation, this gift of her true name, offered freely in the lamplight of the small cabin. Caleb felt the weight of it, the trust implicit in the sharing. My Keiko, he repeated carefully, trying to match her pronunciation. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Very good. You have a good ear for sounds. They spent the next hour with Mai teaching him basic characters, showing him how to write simple words like home and family and music. Caleb proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and practicing each stroke with careful attention. When they finally said goodnight, something had shifted between them again. The formal politeness had given way to something warmer, more intimate. Not the intimacy of lovers, but of two people beginning to see past the surfaces they presented to the world. The trip to Dust Devil Creek the next morning began inauspiciously. The wagon wheel hit a rut barely a mile from the house, jarring all three passengers and causing the carefully packed supplies to shift ominously. Sorry, Caleb muttered, fighting to control the startled horses. It's all right, Mai replied, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the wagon seat. Lily, seemingly unperturbed by the rough ride, chattered about the things she wanted to see in town. The general store with its penny candy, the blacksmith shop, where sparks flew like tiny stars, the church with its tall spire that could be seen from miles away. Will there be other children? She asked Mai. I imagine so. Would you like to make friends? Lily considered this seriously. Maybe, but what if they don't like me? Then they are foolish and not worthy of your friendship, Mai said firmly. But I think you will find that most people are kinder than you expect if you give them the chance. Caleb glanced at her, hearing the note of forced optimism in her voice. She was giving his daughter advice she clearly didn't believe herself. Dust Devil Creek proved to be exactly what Mai had feared, a small insular community where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were subjects of immediate and intense scrutiny. The moment their wagon rolled down the main street, conversation stopped and heads turned. The general store was their first stop, and Mai steeled herself as they climbed down from the wagon. She had dressed carefully in her most conservative dress, a dark blue wool that covered her from neck to ankles and had pinned her hair severely back. But she knew that no amount of careful presentation could disguise what she was. The store's interior was dim and cluttered, smelling of leather and coffee and the indefinable mustiness of goods that had traveled far to reach this remote outpost. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes and a woman whose expression might charitably be called curious. Morrison, the man said by way of greeting. Heard you'd taken yourself a wife. That's right, Barlow. This is Mai. Mai, this is Henry Barlow and his wife Constance. Mai inclined her head politely. Mr. Barlow? Mrs. Barlow, it is a pleasure to meet you. Her careful English, free of accent but somehow still marking her as foreign, seemed to surprise them. Well, Constance Barlow said after a moment, you speak very clearly. Thank you. An uncomfortable silence stretched out as the Barlows took in Mai's appearance, clearly trying to reconcile her obvious refinement with their preconceptions about mail-order brides. Lily needs some winter things, Caleb said, finally breaking the tension. Boots, warmer dresses. As they conducted their business, Mai became aware of other customers drifting into the store. Not, she suspected, because they needed to make purchases, but because word of the new arrivals had spread quickly through the small community. The whispered conversations that followed in their wake were not entirely hostile, but they were laden with curiosity and judgment. Quite exotic, isn't she? Wonder what she cost him. Hope she can cook. Man needs more than pretty to keep him warm in winter. Mai kept her expression carefully neutral, but Caleb noticed the way her posture stiffened, the slight tremor in her hands as she helped Lily try on a pair of small boots. We should go, he said quietly when their purchases were complete. But as they prepared to leave, a woman approached, tall, thin, with iron gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Mrs. Morrison, she said, I'm Dr. Margaret Henrik. I serve as the town's physician, such as we have one. Mai looked surprised. You are a doctor. Shocking, I know, a woman in such a profession. Dr. Henrik's smile was wry but kind. I wondered if I might have a word with you about the herbs I noticed you gathering yesterday morning near Miller's Creek. Mai went very still. Herbs. Willowbark echinacea chamomile. You have an excellent eye for medicinal plants. I don't suppose you'd be interested in helping me prepare remedies for the winter season. I could use someone with your knowledge. The offer was clearly well-intentioned, but Mai felt panic rising in her chest. Public attention was the last thing she needed, even positive attention. Before she could formulate a polite refusal, Caleb stepped in. That's very kind of you, Dr. Henrik, but Mai has her hands full settling into her new home. Of course, but if you change your mind, she pressed a small card into Mai's hand. I'd welcome the assistance of someone who clearly understands the healing properties of plants. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Mai could feel the weight of curious stares following them. But it wasn't until they were preparing to leave that the real test came. A group of men had gathered near the hitching post, ranchers and townsmen, with the weathered look of people who worked hard for modest livings. Their leader, a burly man with tobacco-stained teeth, stepped forward as Caleb helped Mai into the wagon. Morrison, he said, name's Tom Briggs. We heard you'd imported yourself some exotic help. The word imported carried unmistakable implications. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I'd like you to meet my wife, Mai. Mai, this is Tom Briggs. Wife? Briggs' eyebrows rose mockingly. That what we're calling it, hell, Morrison, least you could have done is found yourself a Christian woman. What's this one worship Buddha? Some heathen got with too many arms. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Mai felt every eye in the street turned toward them, waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. Mr. Briggs, she said quietly, I attend no particular church, but I believe in treating others with respect and kindness. Perhaps we might find common ground in that belief. Her response was so unexpected, so gracefully diplomatic, that it seemed to rob Briggs of his momentum. But he rallied quickly. Pretty words, he sneered, but I've heard about you people. Come here taking jobs from honest Americans, bringing your strange ways. That's enough, Caleb's voice cut through the tirade like a blade. He stepped closer to Briggs, and though he was not as large a man, there was something in his bearing that made the other man step back. You're talking about my wife. I suggest you remember that. Your wife? Briggs repeated. Right. Well, Morrison, you just remember that some of us have standards about who we welcome into our community. And some of us, came a new voice, believe in judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. Everyone turned to see Dr. Henrik, standing in the doorway of her clinic, her expression stern. Beside her stood the Methodist minister, Reverend Samuel Grant, a slight man with kind eyes and an unexpectedly authoritative presence. Mrs. Morrison, the Reverend said, stepping forward, I hope you'll consider attending our Sunday service. Everyone is welcome at our church. The public support from two respected community members seemed to deflate the hostile crowd. Briggs spat into the dust and turned away, muttering under his breath about bleeding hearts and foreigners. As they finally left town, the silence in the wagon was thick with unspoken thoughts. Lily, who had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes, finally spoke up. Why was that man so mean to Mom? Caleb and Mai exchanged glances. How to explain to a 7-year-old the complexities of prejudice and fear? Some people, Mai said carefully, are afraid of things they don't understand. That fear sometimes makes them say unkind things. But you're not scary. You're nice. You make good food and play beautiful music. I know, little one, but not everyone sees that right away. Then they're stupid, Lily declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Despite everything, Mai found herself smiling. Perhaps they are simply learning slowly. That evening, as they sat around the table sharing a quiet supper, Caleb found himself studying Mai with new appreciation. The way she had handled the confrontation in town with dignity rather than defiance, grace rather than anger, spoke to a strength of character he was only beginning to understand. You did well today, he said finally. Mai looked up from her bowl surprised. I did nothing. You did everything right. Another woman might have fought back, made it worse. You found a way to diffuse the situation without backing down. I have had practice dealing with difficult people. In San Francisco, she nodded slowly. After the earthquake, when resources were scarce and people were frightened, there was much suspicion directed toward anyone who looked different. I learned that meeting anger with anger only creates more anger, and meeting it with kindness sometimes creates understanding. Not always, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough. Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had touched her intentionally, and the contact sent a small shock through both of them. I'm sorry you had to go through that, today and before. It is the price of being different in a world that fears difference, she said simply. But today was not so bad. Dr. Henrik and Reverend Grant, they showed kindness. There are good people here. It might take time for them to see past their first impressions, but they'll come around. Mai turned her hands so that their palms pressed together, a small gesture, but one that acknowledged the tentative connection growing between them. And if they don't, Caleb's grip tightened slightly, then that's their loss, not ours. Later that night, as Mai sat in her alcove writing in her journal, she found herself recording not just the events of the day, but her growing confusion about her feelings toward the man who had married her, sight unseen. Caleb Morrison was not what she had expected when she had answered his advertisement. She had anticipated a crude, lonely farmer, desperate enough to send away for a wife. Instead, she had found a man with hidden depths, someone capable of growth and understanding. More troubling still was her own response to him. When he had defended her in town, when he had taken her hand at dinner, she had felt something she had thought buried forever in the ruins of San Francisco, the possibility of genuine affection, perhaps even love. But love was a luxury she could not afford. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exposure. And exposure could mean death not just for her, but for anyone who tried to protect her. Because Mai had not told Caleb the complete truth about why she was running. The earthquake had destroyed her family and her school, yes. But it was what came after the earthquake that had forced her to flee, to assume false identities, to live in constant fear of discovery. She had witnessed something in the chaotic aftermath of the disaster, something that powerful men would kill to keep secret. And until she could find a way to make them pay for what they had done, she could never truly be safe. Which meant that no matter how much she was beginning to care for Caleb and Lily, she would eventually have to leave them behind. The thought brought a sharp pain to her chest, surprising in its intensity. When had these strangers become important to her? When had their small cabin begun to feel like home? She set down her pen and touched the jade bracelet on her wrist, her mother's last gift and her constant reminder of what she had lost. But for the first time in 3 years, she found herself thinking not about the past, but about the future, about what it might be like to belong somewhere to someone without fear. Outside her window, she could hear Caleb moving around the main room, banking the fire for the night. Soon he would go to his own bed, and the house would settle into the quiet rhythm of sleep. But tonight, that rhythm felt different somehow. Tonight, it felt like the breathing of a family learning to live together. And despite all of her reasons for caution, Mai found herself hoping that tomorrow would bring another day of that quiet, dangerous happiness that was beginning to take root in her carefully guarded heart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, carried by a rider who seemed too well dressed for the rough frontier landscape. Mai was in the garden harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Something about the rider's bearings, the way he sat his horse with military precision, the way his eyes swept the property with professional assessment, made her blood turn cold. She straightened slowly, her hands full of turnips, and watched as Caleb emerged from the barn to greet the visitor. Mr. Morrison, I have a letter for you from San Francisco. Mai's hands went numb. The turnips fell to the ground with soft thuds. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood, but she could see the way Caleb's posture changed as he read the letter, the way his gaze shifted toward her with new questions in his eyes. When the rider departed, Caleb walked toward her with slow, measured steps. In his hand, the letter seemed to burn like a brand. "My," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Inside the cabin with Lily safely occupied with her afternoon lessons at the kitchen table, Caleb spread the letter on the wooden surface between them. The official seal of the San Francisco Police Department seemed to glare up at Mai like an accusation. "They're looking for someone," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. "A woman named Keiko Yamamoto, wanted in connection with the murder of 3 city officials in the aftermath of the 1884 earthquake." Mai's face had gone pale as winter snow, but her voice remained steady. "I see. The description matches you: age, height, distinguishing characteristics." He paused, studying her face. "They say she's armed and dangerous, that she's been using false identities to evade capture." "And what do you think?" Mai asked quietly. Caleb was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table. "I think," he said finally, "that you've been running from something more dangerous than grief." It wasn't a question, but Mai heard the invitation in it, the chance to finally tell the truth, or at least more of it than she had ever dared reveal. "My name," she said slowly, "is Keiko Yamamoto. Mai Tanaka was a friend. She died on the train journey here of consumption. I I took her identity because I needed to disappear. And the murders," Mai's hands twisted in her lap, "I didn't kill anyone, but I saw who did." The story that emerged, told in halting whispers while Lily practiced her letters nearby, was one of corruption and cover-up of powerful men who had used the chaos following the earthquake to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. "They were selling relief supplies," Mai said, her voice barely audible. "Food, medicine, blankets meant for earthquake victims, selling them to the highest bidders while people died in the streets. When some of the community leaders tried to report it," she didn't need to finish. Caleb could imagine the rest. "You saw this happen. I was delivering medicine to the refugee camps. Dr. Sato had asked me to help because I spoke both languages and could help translate for the patients. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I saw too much." "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Mai's laugh was bitter. "The authorities were the ones doing the killing. The police captain, the city supervisor, even a federal marshal. They had a system, and anyone who threatened it—" "How did you escape?" "Dr. Sato. He knew what they were planning somehow. He got word to me just in time." Her voice broke slightly. "He died trying to warn the others. They made it look like he was caught in a building collapse, but I knew better." Caleb reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were shaking. "And you've been running it ever since?" She nodded. 3 years. Moving from place to place, never staying long enough to form connections. I thought Montana was far enough, remote enough. But they found you anyway. They've been getting closer. That writer, he wasn't just delivering a letter, was he? He was assessing, looking for confirmation." Caleb's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" You're my wife, Keiko. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The use of her real name, spoken with such quiet conviction, nearly undid her completely. "You don't understand. These aren't local bullies like Tom Briggs. These are powerful men with unlimited resources and no conscience. They will kill you, kill Lily to get to me. Then we make sure they don't get the chance." Before Mai could respond, a small voice piped up from the kitchen table. "Papa, what's wrong? You look scary." Both adults turned to see Lily watching them with worried eyes, her slate forgotten in her lap. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Caleb said, forcing his voice back to normal. "Mai and I were just discussing some business matters." But Lily was too perceptive to be fooled by adult reassurances. "Are the bad men coming? The ones who make you scared?" Mai went very still. "What bad men, little one?" "The ones in your dreams. Sometimes at night you talk in your sleep in the other language. You sound frightened." The innocent observation hit like a physical blow. Mai hadn't realized her nightmares were so obvious, so audible. Caleb stood up abruptly. "Lily, go practice your shamisen in the bedroom. Mai needs to teach me something important." When the child was gone, he turned back to Mai with grim determination. "How many are coming?" "I don't know, maybe 3 or 4. They prefer to work quietly, make it look like accidents or random violence. When, soon, probably within a few days, Caleb nodded and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he returned, he was carrying items Mai hadn't seen before, a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt revolver, a rifle that showed signs of professional care, and something else that made her breath catch, a silver badge tarnished with age. Caleb, I wasn't always a farmer, he said simply. Before Sarah, before this place, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal. Spent 10 years tracking down men exactly like the ones who are after you. The revelation recontextualized everything, his careful questions, his ability to read people the way he had handled the confrontation with Tom Briggs. Why didn't you tell me? Same reason you didn't tell me about San Francisco. Sometimes the past is a burden better carried alone. He checked the rifle's action with practiced ease, but alone time is over. You can't fight them, Caleb. They're not ordinary criminals. They have connections, resources, and I know their methods. He set down the rifle and took her hands again. I also know something they don't. What? They're not the only ones with connections. The next morning, while Mai struggled to maintain the appearance of normalcy for Lily's sake, Caleb rode out early. He returned near noon with Dr. Henrik and Reverend Grant, both armed and wearing expressions of grim purpose. Dr. Henrik was a battlefield surgeon during the war, Caleb explained as they gathered around the kitchen table. And Reverend Grant used to be Captain Grant cavalry officer. We've dealt with corruption before, the doctor said bluntly, and we don't take kindly to outsiders coming into our community to hurt decent people. There's something else, Reverend Grant added. Tom Briggs left town yesterday sudden-like, rode east toward the rail line. Mai felt her heart sink. He's gone to meet them, to guide them here. That's what we figured, Caleb said, which means we have maybe 24 hours to prepare. Prepare for what? This isn't some romantic adventure story. These men are killers. So am I, Caleb said quietly, and for the first time Mai saw not the gentle farmer she had come to know, but the federal marshal he had once been. The question is, are you willing to fight back, or do you want to keep running forever? That afternoon, the small group turned the Morrison homestead into something resembling a fortress. Windows were reinforced sightlines, cleared weapons positioned at strategic points. Lily, sensing the adult tension but not understanding its source, was sent to stay with a neighbor family 5 miles away, safely distant but close enough for a quick reunion when the danger passed. As evening approached, Mai found herself in the garden she had worked so hard to create, perhaps for the last time. The autumn flowers she had planted were still blooming, defiant splashes of color against the gathering darkness. Regrets? Caleb asked, joining her among the marigolds and late roses. Many, but not about coming here. Even knowing what it's brought down on us. She turned to face him, this man who had offered her not just shelter but partnership, not just protection but understanding, especially because of that. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the worry lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. Keiko. Yes, if we don't make it through tomorrow, she silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. We will. But if we don't, I need you to know something. What? I love you, not Mai Tanaka, not the woman from the advertisement, but you. Keiko Yamamoto, the teacher, the survivor, the woman who brought music back into this house. The confession hung between them in the cooling air, profound and terrifying and more precious than anything she had ever received. Caleb, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. But she did need to say something because tomorrow might take away the chance forever. I love you too, and Lily, I love the life we've built here, the family we've become. She paused, gathering courage, and I'm tired of running. He kissed her, then soft and sweet and full of promises neither of them might live to keep. They came at dawn as Caleb had predicted they would. 4 men on horseback riding hard across the prairie with Tom Briggs in the lead. Mai watched from the kitchen window as they approached, her heart hammering against her ribs. Remember, Caleb said quietly, checking his rifle one final time. They want you alive. That's their weakness. And their strength, Dr. Henrik added from her position by the front window. They'll try to use that against us. The riders pulled up just outside rifle range and dismounted. One of them, a tall man with a badge glinting on his chest, stepped forward with his hands visible but ready. Misses. Yamamoto, and he called out, I'm Deputy Marshal Collins, San Francisco Police. We're here to take you back to face justice for your crimes. What crimes? Caleb shouted back, appearing in the doorway with his rifle prominent, but not quite aimed. Murder in the first degree, 3 counts. And if she refuses to come, then we'll have to take her by force. Anyone who interferes will be considered an accessory after the fact. Mai stepped into view beside Caleb, her chin raised in defiance. I'm not going anywhere with you. Collins's hand moved closer to his gun. Ma'am, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Am I? Mai's voice carried clearly across the morning air. Tell me, Deputy Collins, how much did they pay you to forget that you swore an oath to protect and serve? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you, Captain Morrison here used to be federal law enforcement. He understands how these things work. She gestured toward Caleb, noting how Collins' eyes widened at the mention of his former rank. How much evidence do you think survives from the earthquake investigation? How many witnesses are still alive to contradict my testimony? Collins exchanged glances with his companions, and Mai could see uncertainty creeping into their faces. You're wanted for murder, he repeated, but with less conviction. I'm wanted because I saw you and your friends selling relief supplies while earthquake victims died in the streets. Because I watched you murder Dr. Sato and Councilman Tanaka and Federal Inspector Rodriguez when they tried to stop you. Prove it. Mai smiled, and there was something fierce and triumphant in the expression. I already have. She reached into her dress and withdrew a small leather portfolio, holding it up where all the men could see. Photographs, she called out. Documentation. Names, dates, transactions. Everything Dr. Sato gathered before you killed him. Everything he gave me to hide before he died. Collins's face went white. That's impossible. We searched. You searched my apartment, my school, everywhere you could think of. But you never searched the one place Dr. Sato knew you'd never look. She touched the jade bracelet on her wrist. My mother's jewelry box sent to a friend in Sacramento before the earthquake. Retrieved only last month and brought here by a very discreet messenger. The lie came so smoothly with such convincing detail that even Caleb almost believed it. But Mai had learned in her 3 years of running that sometimes survival depended on being a very good actress. You're bluffing, Collins said, but his hand was now resting on his gun butt. Am I Captain Morrison? Would you be so kind as to show our visitors your credentials? Caleb stepped fully into view, the silver star pinned prominently on his chest. Deputy U.S. Marshal Caleb Morrison, retired but not forgotten, and as of this morning reactivated for special duty. It was a complete fabrication. Caleb had no authority to reactivate himself, but it sounded official enough to give the corrupt lawmen pause. The evidence Mrs. Morrison described has been copied and distributed. He continued using her married name with deliberate emphasis. One set is already on its way to Washington, another to the territorial capital. If anything happens to her or to any of us, those copies will be opened and distributed to every newspaper west of the Mississippi. Mai could see the calculation happening behind Collins' eyes, weighing risks and benefits, trying to determine if they were really cornered or just being outmaneuvered. The decision came from an unexpected source. Tom Briggs, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spurred his horse forward. Enough of this talking, he shouted, drawing his gun. Let's just burn them out. The shot that killed Tom Briggs came from Dr. Henrich's rifle, clean and precise, and without hesitation. He toppled from his horse like a sack of grain blood spreading across his shirt front. Anyone else want to discuss this unreasonably? She called out, already working the bolt action to chamber another round. The remaining 3 men found themselves caught between the deadly competence of their opponents in the growing realization that they were not dealing with helpless victims. You have one chance, Caleb said into the sudden silence. Ride away. Leave Mrs. Morrison alone. Forget you ever heard of Dust Devil Creek. In return, the evidence stays sealed unless you force us to use it. And if we refuse, Reverend Grant spoke up from his position by the barn, his own rifle trained on the group. Then we defend our community against corrupt lawmen and let God sort out the righteousness of it. Collins looked at his remaining companions, seeing his own doubts reflected in their faces. Tom Briggs' death had changed the equation entirely. This was no longer a simple retrieval operation. It was a war they might not win. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, Mai replied, stepping further into view. It is, because I'm not running anymore, and you can't afford to keep chasing me. Too many people know the truth now. Too many people are watching. The standoff stretched for another long moment, tension singing in the air like a plucked wire. Then Collins holstered his weapon and remounted his horse. "You're making a mistake," he said. "The only mistake," Caleb replied, "was yours. 3 years ago when you decided that money was more important than justice." The three surviving men rode away, leaving Tom Briggs' body in the dust, in a silence that felt like victory. "Is it really over?" Mai asked as they watched the riders disappear into the distance. "For now," Dr. Henrik said, lowering her rifle. "But you'll need to be careful. Men like that don't give up easily." "They will when the alternative is exposure and ruin," Reverend Grant observed. "Sometimes the threat of consequences is more powerful than consequences themselves." That evening, after Lily had been safely returned and the immediate crisis had passed, Mai and Caleb sat together on their front porch, watching the sun set over the prairie that had become their battleground and their home. "The evidence," Caleb said quietly. "Does it really exist?" Mai smiled and touched her jade bracelet. "Some of it. Dr. Sato did give me documents before he died, but not as much as I let them believe. And the copies you sent to Washington. Dr. Henrik took care of that this afternoon while we were negotiating. Amazingly what you can accomplish with a good friend who has connections." Caleb shook his head in admiration. "You're a dangerous woman, Keiko Yamamoto Morrison." The use of all her names, birth name, assumed name, married name, felt like a benediction, a recognition of all the different people she had been and the person she had chosen to become. "I'm a woman who found a home worth fighting for," she said simply. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the garden was bursting with new life, Mai stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast and listening to the sound of Lily practicing the shamisen. The child had progressed remarkably, and the music that drifted through the house was sweet and clear and full of joy. Caleb came in from his morning chores, kissed his wife's cheek, and poured himself coffee from the pot that always seemed perfectly brewed no matter what time he rose. "Letter came yesterday," he said, settling at the table. "From San Francisco." Mai's hands stilled for just a moment on the eggs she was scrambling. "And Miton, federal investigation concluded. 3 former officials indicted for corruption and murder. 2 fled to Mexico, one's been arrested." He paused, watching her face. "They're asking if you'd be willing to testify at the trial." Mai considered this, weighing the risks of exposure against the possibility of true justice for Dr. Sato and the others who had died. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Caleb said carefully, "that you're not the same woman who ran away 3 years ago. You're stronger now. We're stronger. And Lily would be proud to have a mother brave enough to stand up for what's right." From the next room came the sound of music, not the haunting melodies of loss and longing that Mai had played when she first arrived, but something new and hopeful, a song that spoke of home and family and the courage to build a future on the foundation of truth. "Yes," Mai said finally. "I'll testify. It's time to finish what Dr. Sato started." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture that had marked the beginning of their partnership months ago, but now it carried the weight of shared trials, of love tested and proven, of a future they had fought to create together. "Oh no, whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," Mai agreed, and in that simple word was contained all the promise of the life they had built from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of growing things and the distant sound of a shamisen playing songs of hope and healing. In the small cabin that had become a fortress and then a true home, 3 people who had found each other against all odds continued the quiet work of building a family. And in the garden behind the house, where east met west, in a harmony of practical vegetables and ornamental flowers, cherry blossoms bloomed beside prairie roses, a reminder that beauty could take root anywhere if tended with love and patience and the courage to call a place home. The advertisement in the San Francisco Chronicle had promised a hardworking, compliant wife. What it had delivered was something far more precious, a woman who brought not just her skills and strength to a struggling homestead, but her music, her wisdom, her capacity for love that transformed mere survival into authentic life. And in the end, that transformation had saved them all. Epilogue. 1 year later, the letter from the territorial governor arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the same mail rider who had once brought fear, but now brought only the ordinary business of people with settled lives. "Mrs. Morrison," Caleb called from the porch, "you have an official communication." Mai emerged from the house, flour dusting her apron from the morning's baking, and accepted the envelope with curious eyes. "What does it say?" Lily asked, appearing at her side with the shamisen still in her hands. Mai read in silence for a moment, then looked up with wonder in her dark eyes. "The Territorial Education Committee wants to know if I would consider establishing a school here in Dust Devil Creek. A school that would teach both English and other languages to children whose families come from many different places." Caleb moved to stand beside his wife, reading over her shoulder. "They're offering to fund the building construction and provide supplies." "There's more," Mai said softly. "They want to name it the Dr. Sato Memorial School for Cultural Understanding." The three of them stood together in the morning sunlight, considering the remarkable turn their lives had taken. From a transaction born of desperation, they had created not just a family, but a legacy that might help other children navigate the complex world of belonging to more than one culture. "What do you think?" Caleb asked. Mai looked at the letter, then at the man and child who had become her heart, then at the vast Montana landscape that had become her home. "I think," she said slowly, "that Dr. Sato would be proud." And in the distance, carried on the prairie wind, came the sound of children's voices, singing some in English, some in languages carried across oceans and mountains, all of them learning that home is not a place you find, but a place you create with love, courage, and the willingness to see beauty in differences. The silent heart had learned to sing, and its song would echo through generations yet to come.